Hello and welcome to this edition of EMS Now Up Close. It's my pleasure again today to speak with David Schild. He's, of course, is the executive director of the PCBAA, the Printed Circuit Board Association of America. David, good to see you. It's been a while.
It's been a while. Always good to be with you, Eric. I hope it's summer enjoyable for you.
Yeah, it's Texas. It's hot. Hey, listen, a lot has happened since we last spoke. So let's kind of jump in there. I know that the PCBAA, let's start maybe there, had recently had its annual meeting there. Tell me any highlights out of that.
Yeah, I was really thrilled in mid-June that we were able to gather with almost 70 executives from across the PCB ecosystem for what is now our fourth annual meeting. Senator Ruben Gallego from Arizona was our keynote speaker. We had officials from the Department of Commerce, from the Department of Defense. We also had this really great OEM panel featuring Raytheon, Lockheed, and Northrop Grumman. That's the ultimate customer for so many American PCB manufacturers. And of course, in addition to those discussions, we spent a day on Capitol Hill directly lobbying in support of the PCBs Act. And as I've said many times in many venues, nobody tells this story better, Eric, than the men and women who actually do the manufacturing, right? So if you're from VSC, if you're from Summit Interconnect, if you're from TTM and you go up and say, this is the factory, this is the end product, these are the men and women who bring this technology to life, it's such a compelling story in Washington. And we say our mission is educate, advocate, legislate. The reason educate is at the front of that tag is because we cannot expect public policy, we can't expect government action if people don't understand what are PCBs, what are integrated circuit substrates, and what are the challenges, what are the headwinds those industries face.
Yeah, very good. No, I saw some updates on it on LinkedIn, so I'm glad. And that seems to be growing too.
Every year, more people. We're now north of 75 members. I think, our goal is to get past 100. And so that meeting grows commensurately. And I would say that if you're thinking about something to do in June of 2026, we will be back for the fifth annual meeting, more time with our lawmakers, more time on Capitol Hill. We want the biggest possible room we can get.
Yeah, excellent. So talking about Capitol Hill, obviously we spoke, it was spring this year. Things were still kind of in the beginning phases of the new administration. So what are you hearing on Capitol Hill from speakers and from Congress and the Commerce Department these days?
Yeah, it's a very interesting time. I think right now you really see the White House driving the overall legislative agenda in Washington in a way that I don't think any of us who are veterans have seen in almost 3 decades. Certainly, we have the annual authorization and appropriations process, and we can touch on some of the good and bad things that are resultant from that here as we head into August. But certainly the administration is driving trade policy, tax policy, and Buy America, Build in America policies. It's no secret to your audience that President Trump really likes to celebrate these investments by both U.S. and foreign-based manufacturers in the United States. We think that those wins should be flowing into our sales because our story is about restoring American capacity. It's about owning a certain technology vertical. It's about the strategic implications of where we depend on right now for, certain critical technologies. So, I think the atmosphere in Washington is a double-edged sword. We have a real focus on making things in America and buying American products. We have a focus on trade, tariff policies that will lead to that ultimate result. We also have some real fiscal hawks who are concerned about expenditures, who are concerned about the size of the deficit and the federal debt. And what that means, Eric, is I think the environment for grant programs and direct government funding is more challenging than it would have been in previous years. But I think the incentive side of things is very promising, right? And we're always trying to balance out this need for tax credits, tax incentives that will allow businesses to plan, that will create a demand signal against the need for direct capital investments, which of course, that's what makes it possible to buy new equipment, hire new workers, expand your facilities.
Yeah. And I know you also have the added challenge of as government officials come and go, you need to start again with some people and kind of build up, right?
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I think the general public thinks about election day and thinks about, furniture getting swapped out at the White House and thinks, well, that's it. A new administration is in place. Yeah. But in fact, the Pentagon is a great example of this. Once you approve a Secretary of Defense, all of the deputy and undersecretaries, all of the folks who work under them in that chain of command, in that hierarchy, have to be approved by the United States Senate. And there are several key seats still open. The biggest one is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Industrial-Based Policy, a job that was previously held by Dr. Laura Taylor Calais, who is an ally of our industry. That chair is still open at the Pentagon. That job has not been confirmed. And so that is the person who would have the most direct responsibility over the allocation of Defense Production Act or DPA funds. They would oversee industrial policy engagement, supply chain issues. And so while we've seen encouraging signs from the current Pentagon leadership, much of that leadership is not yet installed, as we head into the third quarter. So I think it is a situation where we got to get the Senate moving forward on getting a lot of these nominees confirmed. And then we will be the first ones through the door to meet with them and explain the policy needs that have to be met.
Yeah. So call your senators' offices and tell them to get these people approved. So
Absolutely.
we can get industry back to business again. It strikes me, you mentioned the tariffs there, but I'm also thinking about, I know one of the messages that's always been put forth by PCBA is that you need government investment to attract private investment, right? And you've been very eloquent in how you've spoken about in the past. Those seem almost, with the tariffs, seem to be, as you mentioned, that getting grants approved is going to be a little different now. So how do you see those balancing out?
Our view is that the tariff policy, which is obviously affecting not just microelectronics manufacturing, but really every segment of the economy, is one tool in the toolkit. It's a tool that this administration is choosing to utilize at a much higher rate. And you see there's often an announcement and then a deal and a different implementation than what was announced. And I think with Japan tariffs, with EU tariffs, of course, that was the case. Copper seems to be the one where, we're actually moving forward with specific HST codes and specific copper tariffs that I think inevitably will show up inside of the microelectronics supply chain because they raise the cost of a critical material. Now, that being said, I still think that tax credits and incentives are a different and also very effective tool. What I've heard from business leaders is that they will do less long-term planning around a tariff regime. They will do more long-term planning around tax incentives because generally when Buy and Build America tax credits are put into the tax code, they're there for a long time. I think everybody would agree tariffs are a little bit more of a roller coaster right now in terms of how permanent they're going to be. So business leaders seem to like incentives. We continue to push for incentives as well as grant programs. And of course, we carefully monitor what the tariff environment is like and try to assess what its impact is going to be on microelectronics manufacturing.
Yeah. Now, I did want to mention too, I know that when we were talking about Congress here just a moment ago, you had the opportunity to actually testify on behalf of the industry there earlier. I think it was just a month or so ago in June. You spoke to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Tell me about that and kind of the message you delivered.
Yeah, what a great opportunity for our industry to have a voice in front of Congress. That commission, chartered by Congress, has to produce an annual report on the places where we have significant trade gaps and strategic deltas with China. And so we were called in alongside representatives from the semiconductor industry as well as the pharmaceutical industry to talk about Chinese dominance in those markets. Of course, it's not just microelectronics where there's, effectively a Chinese control of a certain manufacturing sector. And, what I said to the commission was, this is a problem, that we have been a part of our industry through offshoring over the last 30 years. And this was the key message, American companies are not losing to Chinese companies in a fair and open competition. We are losing to the Chinese government and policies that they have implemented over almost half a century, really, that say we want to own certain technology verticals. And so when there is this laissez-faire attitude about the market that says, well, hey, look, capitalism has decided that we're not going to make microelectronics in America, I don't agree with that assessment. And what I told the commission was that these other nations, and specifically China, have been engaged in very focused industrial policy for decades. And we talk about an industrial policy in the United States. It's really within the last decade that we've gotten serious about American manufacturing, that we've gotten serious about reshoring and restoring capacity. And so a lot of my testimony was focused on the nature of the problem and what needs to be done in Washington to start things moving in the other direction so that we don't have to say 9 out of 10 chips basically are coming from Asia. 6 out of those 10 chips are coming from mainland China. And these, boards, and these boards are in everything. PCBs make everything possible from a technology perspective. So, I think it was a wake-up call for a lot of the members of the commission, and I just appreciate the opportunity to tell that story on behalf of our industry.
Yeah. You, you had mentioned before we talked too, we were talking before the interview started here about the GAO report, but specifically, I found it interesting the difference between the primes and the subs within that, the awareness of this. Speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, there's a great report out from the GAO recently that, of course, confirms something that I think we already know inside the industry, which is that when you get deep into defense and aerospace supply chains, that's where you start to have greater concerns about foreign sourcing. And of course, when PCBAA was founded, one of our primary legislative accomplishments and initiatives was around part of the National Defense Authorization Act and specific language that says by 2027, the Pentagon must have a plan to remove microelectronics that are dual use and commercial off the shelf, dual use in COTS from their supply chain. And, those restricted countries include China, North Korea, Russia, Iran. But we obviously have real security requirements around what's in our defense and aerospace systems. This report just confirms that as soon as you get 2 or 3 or 4 levels down inside the supply chain, it becomes very opaque as to the country of origin. That is a concern. And, we are really closely aligned with the primes. I mean, Raytheon is now a member of PCBAA. We're in talks with other primes to come on board because it's a known issue that the supply chain extends very deep inside of some of these complicated systems. And it sometimes goes overseas without an awareness that it's doing so. So the GAO flagging this, the Pentagon identifying this as an issue, and us championing rules and regulations that would restore, a complete domestic supply chain, I think it's all part of the same story.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw the story this morning. Somebody sent it to me about Cadence being fined, Cadence Design
I
Tool,
did not.
found guilty of illegally supplying China's military with it. So now they're being fined, I believe, $140 million or something like that as a result of this. And that's the big design tools, right? Within the semiconductor. So it's not just, the deeper you go, there's also, I guess some parties potentially acting as they ought not under the
The rules around this are very serious. I come out of the defense and aerospace industry myself, and there's, quite a lot of effort devoted to compliance on that front. I think one thing we can do to make it easier for the defense primes is restore domestic capacity. If you want to help these folks secure their supply chain, then be able to say both to your supplier, hey, you're onshore, you're trusted, you're secure, and to your customer, I can vouch for everything I'm sending forward to you, and be able to say that at scale, right? Because microelectronics are just everywhere now in the defense and aerospace ecosystem. So that's the goal. There's a lot of smart and dedicated people working on it, both at the Pentagon, inside of industry, and now I think increasingly on Capitol Hill. And working together, I think it's something we can achieve.
Yeah. And I wanted to touch on that, the Defense Production Act too, that, and to, I know there's a push to try to fully fund that. Where does that kind of stand? Is that at risk even? So
Yeah, it is. Unfortunately, I wish I had better news on that front. As you know, since the DPA was invoked in 2022, and PCBs and IC substrates were designated as a critical national security technology, about $117 million has gone out the door and is currently at work, mostly in UHDI, factories and facilities that are being built across the United States. We count on the DPA to be the tool that the Pentagon uses to build out critical cutting edge technologies for the warfighter. Unfortunately, this year's defense budget does not fund the microelectronics line specifically. Now, that is interesting because so many studies, the National Defense Industrial Base study, other studies out of the Pentagon, the study out of the GAO, have concluded that we have to have secure, trusted, reliable domestic sourcing of microelectronics. So to see the DPA account effectively zeroed really doesn't make a lot of sense to us. And PCBAA, in concert with GEA, is working both on Capitol Hill and at the Pentagon to try to draw attention to this shortfall and see what can be done. I will also say that the language that appropriators moved forward on Capitol Hill really contrasts pretty heavily with where the budget ended up, right? So there was a specific line in the Senate Armed Services, the Senate Appropriations Committee Defense Subcommittee had a line, and I'm going to quote it because I think it's very telling, right? The committee recognizes supply chain vulnerabilities for printed circuit boards are part of a strong domestic manufacturing and defense industrial base. Continued action is needed to expand domestic PCB production capabilities so we may avert crucial technology shortfalls that would impair our national defense. The committee supports the Secretary of Defense's initial investments in PCB manufacturing through the DPA and encourages the Secretary of Defense to continue investments in this key technology area. Now, that is language that our organization, as well as GEA, lobbied very hard to have included. It's clear direction and intent by the Congress telling the Secretary of Defense, we're thrilled that the DPA has been used to invest in domestic PCB capability. Continue that effort. Unfortunately, Eric, the numbers don't match the rhetoric. So we will certainly be showing that language around Washington, right? To say, look, we have to match up what we say are our priorities with how we fund these programs. And it's an ongoing and continuing and, quite frankly, an annual fight.
Yeah. And for the benefit of our listeners, with all the acronyms going, GEA is the new term for what was IPC, now the Global Electronics Association. So in case somebody's looking up government departments there with what you're saying.
Yep.
It's interesting because we were talking before, about, I asked you before the interview, what are the new fabs that have come on board here in the United States. And we're talking about the one at Schweitzer Engineering Labs up in Idaho, SpaceX obviously doing their thing down in Austin. And then you also mentioned TTM also had with their announcement and what they're going to be doing. But so it's starting. The first two are kind of private ones. That was for internal consumption only. It's not going to fuel the market.
Sure.
Whereas TTM's potentially would be for the greater market. But there still is obviously a need for more.
And I think the challenge with the business case, and this is what I hear from all of our executives, is that critical demand signal. It is very difficult to go to Wall Street, to go to any investor community and say, I need to expand my facility. I need to create a new product line that doesn't exist. I need to hire new workers, buy new tooling because we need to manufacture X. The obvious question is for what customer? That's where I think these tax credits are really the game changer, because now you could say to a company weighing either in the defense or the commercial space, foreign production versus domestic production, hey, that tax credit gets us very close to cost parity. It allows you to onshore a critical element of your supply chain. Once we have those incentives, I'm convinced the demand signal will drive investment, and you will see more announcements about expansions, groundbreakings, because the business case will be there.
Mm-hmm. So what else is needed moving
Well,
forward?
I think, look, we have had a very concerted effort for years now on Capitol Hill. There's good legislation in place. There's victories inside authorization and appropriations bills. And I still believe in HR 3597, the Protecting Circuit Boards and Substrates Act, which has bipartisan support. We're working towards a Senate companion bill on that. I will say, I think it is important also to look at the executive branch. As we talked about at the start of this conversation, so much policy now, Eric, is flowing out of the White House. And there are, I think, opportunities for executive orders. There are opportunities for trade and tariff policy. There are major initiatives, and I'll use as an example the discussion about efforts to modernize the FAA and America's air traffic control infrastructure. Secretary Duffy at the Department of Transportation has spoken about the need to modernize these systems, many of which are aging. Wouldn't that be a great opportunity to make sure that when we build out something that I think we would all agree is critical infrastructure, right, that we do so with domestically supplied microelectronics? It seems like an obvious case for buy and build in America. And so I think we also have to look to the executive branch for opportunities to create demand signals and create policies that foster more American manufacturing.
Yeah. Well, David, I hear that if you have his cell phone number, Trump does answer his phone when it rings. I've heard that from many journalists, right? So
I hear the same thing, and yet somehow no one ever sends me that number.
So if anybody out there has it, please reach out to David. So, hey, listen, before you go, I do want to kind of acknowledge the PCBA. I see that you did last month, it was announced you won the Summit Silver Award from the American Society of Association Executives. That is certainly a feather in the cap of the PCBAA for the work it's done and recognized for the last many years. What would you like to say about that?
Well, look, we're honored to be recognized for our efforts. As you know, we're still a relatively new organization. We've gone from 5 to 75 members in a little less than 4 years. I think that we continue to see a growth trajectory in terms of not just the number of companies, but the diversity. We see more raw and refined material suppliers. We see more folks in the assembly and tooling space. We see the OEMs now coming on board. And I also think that our advocacy efforts in Washington are making a difference. And so I'm really proud of the recognition that we got from ASAE. And I hope this won't be the last award, but we're focused on results. It's great to be recognized for what we've done so far. What I want to produce for our members and for American microelectronics manufacturing are long-term sustainable investments and policies so that we can look back 10, 15, 20 years from now and say, this was the beginning of this manufacturing renaissance. This was when we really started to turn the tide and put this stuff back on our shores where it belongs.
Yeah. So put the award on the shelf. Don't get complacent and keep moving forward, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, good. David, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Let's
Thanks,
do this
Eric.
again because obviously it's an ever-changing environment in which you're operating there.
We're going to stay busy. I look forward to our next conversation.
Very good, sir. Take care. Thank you.